But let's wait till the slides are okay.
Oh, you've got it now. Sean will have to lock the first bit off.
Yes, okay. Okay, well, welcome to the EVA London Symposium panel session for the evening. It's nice to see you here. My name's Jonathan Bowen. I think I know quite a lot of you already. And my co-chair, and probably really main chair, is Tula Giannini. So I'm just going to do a little introduction to start with, hand over to Tula, who will introduce the symposium panel and then introduce the three speakers. So the idea is three speakers will each present their sort of position statement for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'll open it up for discussion amongst the panelists, but also amongst you as the audience as well. So please do feel free to contribute. So just to go through a few associated things, because these are the sort of things that have led up to this panel, a few papers and so on. And there is a paper in the proceedings there at the bottom in slightly larger type, so you're welcome to go and have a look at that. I'll probably go and put a link to that in the chat in a moment. So you're welcome to have that open as well if you want to be reading the associated paper, which is basically short position statements. And these are our three panelists. We've got Rachel Faulkner, who's a digital curator from Goldsmiths, also at Whitechapel Gallery in London. Michael Takio Magruder, who's a digital artist based at National Archives here, but also over in the US as well. So he's got a sort of visiting position there. And Emmanuel Marconi, who, despite the name, is in France rather than in Italy. And he's in a very nice small musical museum. So he's going to give a sort of museum curatorial view. So with that, I'll hand over to Tula. And this is her slide. So Tula.
Okay, there I am.
Yeah.
So the real theme of this is the beyond human theme. And I'm sure for each of you, as we hear your talks, it plays out in very different ways. And so that each of you as an artist and a human being with an identity, we're in a period of great transformation, really, evolution. And so this is really thinking about your work and your identity and you as a human being and how being in this very technological age, in the middle of computing, in a sense, transforming our very being and senses. So I wrote a little poem about this to express kind of the emotion behind it. And I'm going to read that and then turn it over to Rachel, and we'll move forward. I'm having a little trouble hearing, actually. Beyond human. Yes, did you say something?
We can hear you, so it's
We
fine.
can. It's me hearing myself.
Okay.
Beyond human, I'm a woman. My extended digital powers like Turing's sunflowers, AI and machine learning. I'm yearning for augmented reality in physical space. Escape from cyberspace, can't embrace digital isolation, losing concentration, seeing life through a screen, missing what it means to be human in a post-COVID world. So I'm actually in this picture, I am behind the screen. So now we have Jonathan, our next slide. Here we go.
Was there another slide?
No, that's what you said.
that's the end. Yes.
That's the end.
Yeah. So I think with that we're going to introduce
Rachel, the star.
Yes, the big digital star there.
That's right. Where are you?
And do yes,
I'm right here.
Share her screen.
Okay.
Right here.
Okay, good.
I'm just sharing my screen now.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that amazing poem, Tula. This missing being human is kind of really central to, yeah, to kind of my thinking at the moment.
Oh, good. Wow.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to discussing, like, you know, maybe we can look at that poem like later, you know, in kind of context with the speakers' papers as well. So I guess so my paper or my presentation or my, I guess my provocation is called Transmuting Realities, Refiguring Distributed Identities. And today, I guess I wanted to set out a few positions or provocations for us to discuss in the context of the theme Beyond Human. Starting off by proposing that the assumed binary relationships between the virtual and the physical stands on shaky ground. I suggest that the borders between the real and the virtual are being treated with increasing suspicion because of our technology-driven, almost like soporific cross-inhabitation of both lived states. The real and the virtual exist suspended in a kind of, I guess, entangled fuzzy logic of ambiguity, where the previously solid walls and distinctive architecture of these separate realities have become hazy and porous, accelerated for sure by the COVID-19 pandemic, but arguably a transmutation that was already kind of inevitable, or in the post maybe. I'm then going to introduce the revised figure of the curator as they navigate their way through these permeable realities and representations, where we as curators are beginning to perform a finely sutured remodeling or reimagining of the logics and politics of aggregation and display. New forms of agency are beginning to emerge as the sole curator becomes less of the sovereign gatekeeper and tastemaker and more of a collaborator or agitator. This provokes new attitudes and hierarchies of engagement with creative artifacts across the digital commons and beyond, filtering into other imaginations of our new hybrid lived experience. Consequently, I guess the status of the artist is actually refigured as a kind of amorphous, elastic set of identities operating across a multiverse of platforms, portals, and ultimately recast white cube constructs, signaling a point of identity crisis, but also of emancipation, of freedom, a radical curatorial turn perhaps, and a progression and the adoption of new apparatus for networks and modes of exchange with creative artifacts and knowledge production, which embrace our condition of kind of cohabiting and collaborating with what I guess Tula was kind of pointing towards, which is the non-human computational agents of cultural exchange and aggregation. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit around this idea of the virtual versus the real, or these unstable binaries that are beginning to kind of really take shape now. So following the logic and arguments put forward by media theorist Nathan Jurgensen more than a decade ago, he questioned the so-called concept of digital dualism, where the bias towards the real or in real life encounters and the subsequent diminishing of importance allocated to our virtual behavior and operation is beginning to be called into question. Jurgensen instead proposed that we should challenge this idea that the on and offline are separate realities, and that we need to make the leap towards thinking of them as an enmeshed kind of situation or a fabric, something akin to a permanent state of augmented reality. This idea and attitude has been adopted and championed by other theorists along the, along years, and practitioners, popularized recently, I guess most famously by Legacy Russell's dissolution of the boundaries between what she calls AFK, or away from keyboard, and in real life, in her cause to promote the attributes of glitch feminism. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but maybe we can revisit that slide later. It could be reasonably argued as the proliferation of cultural engagement spanning the online and offline picks up a forced pandemic-driven pace, that we can observe that our experience of the world, or worlds that we inhabit, have increasingly nebulous walls between different lived realities. This was writ large surely during the early days of the pandemic, where we retreated into a strange hybrid state of like hyper-domesticity lockdown on the one hand, and an increasingly outward-facing and global urge to communicate and connect across the network on the other, which is a kind of strange state to be in. The reinforcement of a kind of belief system of digital intimacies and the slippages between on and offline existence became and are becoming increasingly fuzzy. In this way, the kind of fetish objected or objectification of offline experiences becomes diminished through the clear recursive feedback loop between how we behave and navigate both our identities and the world constructed or co-constructed online, and how this begins to inform and cultivate our AFK behavior and expectations. So I wanted to turn this kind of optic now onto the culture industry, and specifically onto the cultural constructs of the gallery and museum in particular, and their increased need, undoubtedly accelerated by the pandemic and consequent economic and cultural fallout by museums and galleries to reconfigure and reimagine their relationship to this blurring of the boundaries between the real and the virtual, the online and offline, and what and where a more distributed relationship to a dispersed and hybrid audience or audiences is becoming increasingly more urgent. The pandemic certainly accelerated the need to re-examine the core business models and structures of galleries and cultural institutions, but it could be argued that it had been in the post for some time, for quite some time, I would suggest. And the opportunity for the inevitable and perhaps radical recasting of the relationship between audiences and networks, computational cultural artifacts, is something that is now moving from theory and critical posturing, I guess, into the realms of actual curatorial practice, you know, in the field. So my research practice, for example, as a curator, is really kind of embedded in this and suggests that by deploying radical curatorial languages and alternative worlding tactics across the culture industry, with a particular focus on museum and galleries, the conditions for emergent forms of knowledge production and a renegotiation of the agency of the network apparatus can start to be optimized. The mapping of these new modes and politics of display onto the museum or gallery system have a situated contextual effect on the dynamics of control and sovereignty the figure of the sole curator has historically represented and encompassed, opening up spaces for co-authorship and a multiverse of curatorial languages to coexist across network logics of curating. The shifting of power relations to a more distributed network mode of curatorial gatekeeping represented in my research and practice is framed through the lens of feminist technoscience and situated entanglements across the complexity of relationships between human and non-human entities, including machines, alternative forms of intelligence, including AI and machine learning, and the potential of networks to reconfigure social and technological behaviors. The shifting dynamics of the network's curatorial platform or portal as a multi-sites of exhibition and display are in a constant state of flux and ripe for interrogation and disruption. So I return to my initial sort of question or provocation of what challenges and opportunities could an expanded networked curatorial practice provide museums and galleries in relation to the accelerated new dialogue with distributed communities of audiences. And the audiences really are a key kind of focal point here. And does this proposal for a fragmented, decentered mode of curatorial agency provide the conditions for potential disruptions of hierarchies across knowledge production, the opening up of digital diasporas, and the leverage of human-machine interactions across the politics of cultural production and consumption? So there really aren't any kind of ready-made new models or answers that neatly square the circle in response to this, but there are initiatives and attempts to remodel the power relations between cultural institution, networked art practices, and curatorial custodianship that exist in these kind of liminal in-between spaces of online-offline experience and embodiment. Right, so fundamentally, I've noticed that more than anything else, the hostage kind of shift to online curatorial modes of operating has opened up new and kind of progressive languages around collaborative practice. Collaboration and the impulse towards the working through of a collective voice or voices by artists and curators alike have become dynamically adopted and co-opted to reach out to distributed audience spaces and participants. So audiences become participants, no longer, passive, but they start to have a kind of more active kind of agency about them. And this in turn has started to affect the way we imagine or construct our target audiences, opening up the broadcast model, if you like, away from the one-to-many of the big blockbuster show where the curatorial voice acts as a kind of universal kind of grand narrator figure to the masses, and a turn towards a many-to-many model where new and exciting multiple points of entry and access, and more importantly, exchange, is embedded within a collaborative network logic. I'm going to talk about a couple of recent examples that point towards this shift in dynamic, just as a point of interest. So the first is a curatorial project and virtual residency platform that you can see on the bottom right of the screen called Spur, or Spur World. And this was curated and directed by the artist Joey Holder and curator Julia Greenway during the course of the last few months. And Spur was a virtual residency platform uniting international graduates working across digital mediums. Spanning workshops, collaboration, and mentorship, this residency program facilitated new methodologies for working collectively online. Consisting of 14 virtual worlds, the online exhibition represents the subconscious domain of the residents' custom avatars. Working within themes and representations of mysticism, ritual, and the natural world, the collective utilized game engine technology to form complex yet cohesive narratives. I guess as an audience member or participant, this model kind of provided various and complex modes of engagement, and the collaborative spirit and open interpretation of narrative and positioning of artworks was super engaging and generated a sense of open access to the modes and languages of the curatorial that I had not really encountered before. This is not just replicating the white cube environment online, which a lot of the other online exhibition platforms have resorted to or are constrained to do for various reasons as their sole strategy in response to the enforced mass migration to online modes of display. But for me, this is like a brilliant example of actively disrupting the power structures between artwork, audience participation, artist identity, and curatorial authority. The second project that we can see on the top left of the screen is another online residency model that I actually co-curated with Arbite Gallery in London last year, called Ingrid. So Ingrid was another collective residency between artists from Goldsmiths Computing Department in collaboration with Arbite Gallery and their Arbite on Screen initiative, or AOS. So through artistic invention, performance moments, a vibrant and open public program of events, and a live platform that constantly reinvents itself, Ingrid set out to question and repurpose how we exchange ideas, work in progress in public, and communicate as individuals and as collectives out to a wider, more distributed idea of what an audience interacting with an art object could be. Ingrid sought from the outset to comment on the potential of the digital to merge with the physical, whilst also acknowledging that the threads of privacy, agency, and digital equity constrain and invade our lived experience of our hybrid realities. I guess what was interesting about being involved in the residency as the curator was that the expectation to generate artifacts or art objects became desaturated, and instead an emphasis on process, open dialogue, and exchange between private and public spaces became my priority as the group evolved their unique kind of collaborative model and energy. We generated experimental models for public interaction and moments of display, and invited practitioners to come into our space, not only to present and talk about their work and practice, but to feed into and inform the development of the residency dynamic itself. No finished pieces of work were presented in the culmination of the residency, but instead a kind of celebration of process, collaboration, and intervention was facilitated through network logics of curating an artistic practice, where discussion and experimentation became the new cultural currency and created new points of entry for the audiences. So I guess in conclusion, I would kind of like put a slight sort of question mark over these kind of shifts and dynamics that are taking place. I guess these models or modes of remodeling will only really start to take effect once our access and behavior becomes truly hybrid again, and the return to some kind of IRL or in real life exhibition and formats are really tested out, and the new emergent economies and modes of operating traditional galleries and institutions are going to have to sort of begin to adopt over the next few months. I would suggest that this merging and muddying of realities leads us once again to revisit Nicholas Luhmann's seminal positioning of art as a social system. And I guess we must mind or find our place within it as human and non-human, algorithmic and machinic actants operate across different shared spectrums. So looking forward to the discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Bravo.
Let me just unshare my screen.
Okay.
Okay.
So shall we go straight on to Michael, or does anyone want to say
Yes, I
anything
think so.
briefly? Yes, I think we'll have the 3 presentations first, and then we'll open up discussions. So Michael.
Sounds good. Well, it's really it's a pleasure to be a part of this symposium panel tonight. So in terms of what I thought I would talk about is just quickly like bring people up to give people a sense of my particular work now, and how that might relate to work that's going to be produced sort of once we come out of this pandemic. In terms of my practice, really for the last over 20 years, pretty much everything that I've done has been computationally based. And with that, you know, it's been a combination of both online spaces and emerging virtual worlds. I was well known for doing internet-based art sort of in the early 2000s on places like Turbulence and Rhizome, you know, 2D things in Flash, 3D generative works using things like VRML and combinations of Java. And then of course, on the virtual world sides, the kind of emerging shared virtual environments, things that were done in Open Simulator and Second Life, a variety of these projects. And of course, you know, like most of us at the time, you know, we did actually showcase them online through places like Furtherfield here in the UK, or Rhizome or Turbulence in the US, and had kind of artist studios and online exhibitions. And I should also mention kind of, if that's myself as the artist, for myself as kind of the person and the things that I've loved, I've always been involved in sort of looking at 3D and VR technologies. I think about my sort of early days when I was in university, and here's a picture of the system that I was working on in the labs. It was the good old Silicon Graphics sort of Indigo, and at that time I was, you know, a big fan of playing games like Doom and Wolfenstein and things like that, as kind of the 3D technologies were kind of coming into that consumer prosumer space, if you will. And sort of then as an artist, as new things have come online, whether it's been sort of various revisions of headsets, or like say ways to do kind of immersive projection, like in this case, you know, mobile domes, 360-degree sort of virtual worlds, I've always sort of been a person that has experimented with those kinds of things. And even to this day, in terms of like say shared virtual environments in gaming, I lead a clan in Destiny. I'm a big gamer. I spend far too much time in on my PlayStation, sort of doing that sort of thing. But that's just kind of me being honest. So both on the sort of the work and life, it's something that's just been really kind of a part of all my existence, really, for ever since childhood. And with all that in mind, one of the things that I've always tried to do, maybe somewhat uniquely, is to take the kind of the virtual and the digital and get those into kind of physical experience in my work. So even sort of back in the early 2000s when London got its first digital video wall, I was there using it. So like working in public space, bringing those kind of digital creations into it, or say black box environments in museums and galleries, or big kind of performance spaces, doing these sort of virtual physical performances. This is a picture of a performance I led at Hellerau outside of Dresden, or bringing things into, like, say, historic spaces, you know, taking something that's unapologetically sort of like leading edge digital and merging it with the historical, and of course, sort of a white cube classic gallery space, museums. Those galleries, that's where my work usually does end up, but again, in a physical form. Of course, keeping kind of true to the notion of computational practice, that if you take away from any of these shows, the computer, the data, the code, the networks, all that, you would just have nothing. There would be nothing to show. And sort of with that in mind, that I think about, okay, well, what now? And what are the things that interest me now, if that's where I've kind of come from? And for me, there came a point where I started to think about, well, why don't we kind of take, yes, I've been bringing the digital and the virtual into these kind of physical experiences, but can I feed back? Can I actually, you know, start going and looking at that sort of as another way, using the physical is actually the starting point. So in this line of work, I'll just show one particular project that's a recent sort of large project that I've done that was right before the pandemic. And it's the Imaginary Cities project that I did with the British Library. Now, I was invited by British Library Labs a number of years ago to come in and to explore their digital collections. And of all the things that I could work with, one thing that I decided to pick was the 1 million images from Scans Books collection. And the reason that I wanted to use this particular collection was because it was something that was everything that I thought a digital collection should be. It was open source. It was available online. It's hosted on Flickr Commons. So the material is free to use, free to remix. It is truly, in my opinion, everything that a digital collection should be, because not only are the collection items there, you know, they're in sort of like, say, scanned image form, but it also has metadata. And it has, you know, and again, sort of, so this idea that it's not just some kind of cheap, quick and dirty digitization of an analog thing. It is sort of these scanned images that have come out of this large collection of Victorian books, and then they've been processed, both sort of computationally using AI systems to kind of, you know, to tag them, to add metadata, but also through a number of volunteers, large initiatives they've done, or even members of the public can come in and add sort of tags or comment and do things to the collection items. So again, it's that kind of, for me, it's that perfect sort of kind of taking from all the possibilities, you know. So with that, I picked that particular collection to work with, and I became very fascinated with the digital maps and this notion of sort of maps and cities in particular. And I was doing a lot of sort of reading and thinking, and of course, Calvino's sort of seminal book, sort of, you know, Invisible Cities kind of came to mind, and I reread that. I started thinking about, well, could I start using collection items coming from the physical, you know, as a portal into the digital collection, and then bring that sort of full swing where then I'm taking those sort of, that kind of research that's been done at the British Library, those collections that have been created, that is both an analog and a digital collection. Could I take the summation of those two things, the fact that the public have engaged with it, the curators at the British Library have engaged with it, take that as a resource, and then make new artistic products, which would then feed back into that, sort of thus completing the loop. So that's what I did. And So it was a very long sort of project. It was about 3-4 years in the making, and it culminated in a big solo exhibition there at the library, where what I had done is I had taken 4 particular cities. I decided to pick from over on this side of the Atlantic, London, of course, and Paris, and then across the Atlantic, New York and Chicago. And I did one piece for each based on one map, one from a physical book that was a digitized and part of the collection. And that became the show. So it was sort of this combination of these new digital artifacts, the physical collection items, the digital collection items, the fact that some of them were changing all the time. And yes, and kind of this virtuous circle of like kind of everything at once. So just to give you a little bit of a better sense, I'm going to quickly switch and just show this little promo video that was made by the library to promote the show. So the exhibition was really well received. It ended up being on display for the better part of 6 months there at the library. And one of the things that I was hoping to achieve with it, which kind of gets to the topic of today and sort of how things are going to be, and once we kind of try to get back to some normal, but it's going to be a new normal, is that I wanted with the show to not only kind of celebrate the 2 decades of digital research and digital collections and all the things that were kind of going on behind the scenes to make this sort of show possible. I also was looking at this idea of artwork as interface. So that my artworks could actually be an interface not only to the collection items, but the collection itself. And again, sort of building up these virtuous circles. So this particular piece, which I'll kind of describe in a bit of detail, the New York City's piece. Now, this was based on, again, a physical map of New York City, an early sort of like 18th century map that was part of this collection of over 100,000 books that had been scanned, and then using algorithms, the researchers at the library basically took out all the images. So the image gets taken out, it's digitized, it's sort of uploaded there on Flickr, it's part of this big collection. And then by using kind of large, data methodologies, kind of this idea of, small data and big data, I find the map, I as an artist identify it, and then I use that is the seed to produce a real-time virtual environment, which is what you see here, that you get 2 experiences of that city. It's the kind of the projection is the kind of fly through, the aerial fly through, and you can see the person there standing with the headset, which has a street view. And there's kind of this atmospheric soundscape. Now, the city is actually produced from a server application that basically cuts up and reworks that image and creates this kind of fantastical kind of, in a sense, grid kind of map of the city, an imaginary city. But that process, which is defined by the algorithms and the aesthetic processes that I've defined, is actually influenced every day by visitors to the collection item. So it tracks things like likes and tags and so on and so forth. And it makes a cryptographic hash. And then the server program picks that and uses that as part of the randomization process. And then what happens is that when the sort of the installation comes alive in the morning, the city is built in real time and it lasts for a day. And then sort of the next day it will be a new city. And it's completely, you can't determine it because of course the collection item and the interactions of the public around the world with the collection item are changing all the time. So with the changes of the collection item, the virtual city changes. And then of course, by every artwork in the show, I provided basically a QR code where you could go immediately to the collection item with people's phone on your own mobile, and then you could start, you would visit it. So just by that process, the artwork would be changed, but you could also tag it. You could add layers and add metadata. So this idea that the artwork then becomes the interface, so the exhibition was an interface. And for me, that was really one of the things that I wanted to get to, because one of the things I find very beautiful in this day and age is this idea of, you can start to take a journey, and as an artist, I can outline a journey that I've taken, and I can allow people to take their own journey. So, you go to that first collection item there that is linked to this artwork, but then from that collection item, you can start jumping all through, both internally within the 1 million images from British Library, but also other images that kind of exist there on Flickr. So, for me, that's kind of the point and kind of the beauty. And I think really that's what I really hope for in this kind of post-COVID, as we come into some kind of new normal, as we emerge from this. I think, personally, we have been forced, of course, to be online. And during that time, I think the public has become quite savvy with various different sort of digital and virtual technologies and the benefits that they can bring. And even though that people are longing for the physical, they're not going to forget about the virtual. And for me, the post-COVID experience is going to be something that is blended, that kind of continues to integrate those two things. Much like Rachel was talking about, sort of this coming together, and not us thinking about, in things in such binary terms. I also absolutely feel that such experiences, people are going to want things that are shared, whether it's online, whether it's sort of in real life, or whether, like I'm talking about here, it's some combination of the two, that it's going to be a shared experience. And lastly, and again, this is something that, Rachel brought up as well, this idea of authenticity, something that is live, something that is, live in a very beautiful sense, in that kind of ephemeral sense. The happy chance that, the juxtapositions between things, the fact that, like, say, in a project like Imaginary Cities, it is this shared, it's this authentic thing. It is based on not only what I, as the artist, or the British Library as the institution, or its curators, or the members of the public that are engaging with the work. It's some kind of connection of all three that's kind of coming together and making this new thing. And that, for me, is where I think things are kind of going to go as we emerge from lockdown and start to open up. So that's kind of it for me. So I will hand back to you, Tula.
Thank you for that really beautiful talk. I have to say, I went to Imaginary Cities at the British Library 2 times.
Oh, excellent. So you've seen it
was
there.
A great experience. It was really, and you could see it each time. I should have gone more. It was different each time. And everything that you said really plays out into that exhibition. So you have so many options and experiences that you can blend in different ways. And I've been going to the British Library for many, many years. And I think this was one of the great highlights. So I want to thank you for that experience. Unfortunately, I think as the show closed, I haven't been to the British Library since.
Yes. It's they extended the run for 4 months because it was proving so popular. They were getting several thousand people a day through the show. And the nicest thing is what I love about being a visual artist is no one really knows what you look like. So I would just be in the library for meetings, and I would kind of pass through, and one of the nicest experiences where I would see families there with their kids, you know, multi-generational families from all over the world. And when I would hear the little comments of, you know, people like, oh, you know, look at this, and this is so cool, or this is a really important thing, or this is such and such, and you know, it just kind of brought back feelings for me about my own sort of youth and growing up by the Smithsonian and having those similar kind of experiences with my friends and family. And, you know, this idea that, you know, certainly access, I think that's another thing that Rachel mentioned, which I absolutely agree on. Access, you know, being digital does not make it equal. And actually, you know, I would put forward that the pandemic has shown a new forms of digital divide that we have to be very aware of. But the digital does have the possibility to open up new things. So if you think about a place like British Library, which is so sort of entrenched in, of course, the UK's colonial past and all those kinds of issues, that's a lot of baggage. But the fact is that these things aren't going to disappear overnight. But by having, like, say, a truly open source digital collection, like the 1 million images, you know, there are ways to address that, and there are ways that sort of the digital can kind of help, I think, with proper sort of institutional focus, get us more on the right path. But we should save this for the conversation.
Yes, actually, your talk makes a beautiful segue to Emmanuel's talk, because he really is in a very physical environment, but he's done amazing things to bring his collections at the Musée des Instruments à Vent to the general public, both in the real and the virtual environment. His work with Google, I'm sure he'll tell you about things. So I think this is a perfect segue. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Emmanuel.
You're muted, Emmanuel.
Oh,
Emmanuel.
is he there?
He is there, but he's muted.
Yeah.
Oh, he was muted.
Yeah.
You didn't hear what I said.
No, I heard.
Okay.
You didn't hear what he said, though. So.
No.
Can you see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. So thank you very much, first of all, and well, good afternoon. We'll give a brief description of what happened to our museum at our museum during the pandemic, and the use of a quite traditional digital technology that allowed us to move forward. Just a brief introduction. We are located in the village of La Couture-Busset, which is about 90 kilometers west of Paris in the region of Normandy in the north of France. And this museum, the Wind Instruments Museum, is a small museum located in an historically active woodwinds production area. And the museum was founded in 1888 by the musical instrument workers of the village. And the museum celebrated its 130th anniversary in 2018. This area was the cradle of the development of the recorder or the transverse flute, and contributed to development of the clarinet and the oboe. In 2020, as any other French museum, we have been closed and almost silent due to the pandemic from March 17 to May 11, and then again from October 30 to June 4, 2021, so more than 8 months. The lack of sound does not belong to a museum, especially one with musical instruments. Voices, noises, music are all part of the oral landscape with which we are familiar when walking through the entrance. COVID-19 has silenced most of these, and new sounds have replaced the old familiar ones, symbolizing the transition from innately suffering the consequences of the pandemic to resilient reaction. During the first lockdown, we had again, as anybody else, to reinvent ourselves and focus on new priorities. Regular social media activities has allowed the digital public to keep in touch with the museum and discover some behind the scenes aspects. The collective effort has been possible thanks to the traditional digital technology and the will of the staff in reimagining the museum. We basically doubled the number of Facebook posts, changing the topics from the usual posts on just our collection to a series featuring instruments from the village in European and American museums, from the Metropolitan to the NFA in Boston to museums in London, in Brussels, and so on and so on. In an effort to make people forget the lockdown and dream about traveling again. At the same time, we launched an Instagram account to explore that opportunity too. And to not forget a more personal connection. In collaboration with a local radio, we developed a few short, about 3-minute long podcast on the museum, its history, and the history of some woodwind instruments. And that again was a first for us, with my colleagues happily accepting the challenge to learn new software, editing audio and music, and so on and so on. Finally, with the idea of reopening at some point the museum, a small bilingual booklet to replace the old gallery material single sheets was designed and prepared for the visitors to keep and to diminish as much as possible the manipulation of shared materials at the reopening. After the first weeks of lockdown, not knowing for how long the new situation would continue, I decided to focus more on curatorial activities as the inventory of the collection, while at the same time finalizing the project started a few months before to join the platform Google Arts and Culture. The project required a good amount of time to learn how to use this new tool and to write the several stories that would feature different aspects of our institution. The Google project has allowed the museum to make accessible online more than 300 documents from the archives in very high resolution, as you can probably see, create stories and presentations and translate them into English and share them worldwide. The project was made public on June 11, a week after the museum reopening after the first lockdown. Since the reopening, we can benefit from being geo-referenced on the Google Arts and Culture application. The silence caused by absent public and empty galleries has slowly been replaced by the noise of high-definition scans, digital cameras, and strobes in a collective effort to digitize as much and as quickly as possible their collections, to exploit the imposed suspension of traditional museum life. To fight the state of uncertainty, we decided to launch the ambitious project to catalog and digitize the entire collection, a project needed for years and always previously postponed for logistical and organizational reasons. The lack of public has allowed the museum to use the 2 galleries as working space. The staff, as well as an intern, I've been working on cataloging the objects with newly acquired database software, and in parallel, a website project has started, which will become the main access point to the collections, thanks to an integrated online public access catalog. We hope by the end of this year. And a temporary exhibit with its bilingual catalog entitled Leon Leblanc, Man a Century, initially scheduled for June 2020 opened in September due to delays in setting up the new temporary gallery, and closed exactly 2 months later due to the second lockdown with very little visitors. A mini website was prepared and allowed to see part of the displayed objects. And finally, in fall 2020, during the second lockdown, we immediately started planning the 2021 temporary exhibit devoted to Camille Saint-Saëns in occasion of the centenary of his death, and in partnership with the Institute for Research in Musicology of the Sorbonne University. The exhibit that will open Saturday, 10 July, basically in 3 days, is accompanied by a 300 pages bilingual book. The genesis of this exhibit well represents the degree of uncertainty we were exposed to, not knowing if and when a temporary exhibit would have been possible in summer 2021. We concentrated our efforts on writing a book on Camille Saint-Saëns and wind instruments, and the exhibit, the choice of the topics and the objects is in fact a consequence of the book, which is quite the opposite of what is traditionally done. The pandemic situation has accelerated a process that was already perceived as necessary for a long time. This includes making available the collections to the public worldwide, organizing temporary exhibits and publishing catalogs, enabling the study of woodwind instruments, and preserving, promoting, and keeping alive the memory of all people that have worked in the region of La Couture Busset in northern France. So this is, again, a very, very traditional approach that of survive, I would say, that allow to use digital technologies in the most traditional ways. So nothing new on that point of view, but with the goal of trying to keep our online public in touch with us, and also after the pandemic, being able to reveal a new museum, at least a new digital museum, because the actual physical museum won't change for at least the next 3 or 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful journey of all the amazing work you've done. I mean, I can remember being at La Couture Busset at the museum when it looked like someone had just left it in about 1899. You know, I mean, very little had been done. And so this pandemic, in a way, with me having to move towards digital, had, in a way, a great impact and a motivation. But I imagine as you move forward that the public is going to gain tremendous awareness, and also with the Google project, because this was long a very sleepy kind of a place. And now it has a presence on the global stage, which is really wonderful.
It is indeed one of the characteristics of this very little museum with a very important historically important collection is that there's much more interest worldwide than locally, which is great. Yes. From a certain point of view, because the most difficult part is done. We just have to work locally, which is another series of challenges, but it's easy to promote a collection where there is such interest in almost every country where the musicians playing woodwind instruments. So that's the very easy part.
Great, great. Okay. So now we're going to break out into a panel discussion. And who would like to lead that with some thoughts on what you've said so far? How about Rachel?
Wow, I mean, like, what a lot of territory we've covered, and I think that the other two speakers were so generous, kind of inviting us into their process and practice and kind of the mechanisms and raw thinking and challenges that they faced along the way. I guess maybe I keep coming back to this kind of weird kind of shifting of or breaking down of the binary, and I think that both both Emmanuel and Michael have spoken really kind of quite closely to this kind of at least recursive loop or questioning or unsettling of the binary between the virtual and the real. And I can't quite put my finger on what connects us all, but there is something there that I think that we keep coming back to, this kind of at least if not a definitive blurring of the boundaries, certainly a questioning of the edges, or kind of like the edges are becoming less kind of less of a straight hard line and much more kind of porous. And I was just wondering how everybody, how both of you felt about this kind of thinking about it in a little bit more of an abstract sense. What is it about this binary opposition that's beginning to soften for you?
Well, I just want to say one thing with that is that people generally, a huge part of their life, whether they're looking at a screen or it's embedded digital, talking to a computer that does things for them. I mean, it's so embedded in our behavior day to day that it is changing how we feel about ourselves and our identity. So it is, in essence, right now, I think it's inseparable. A little early yesterday, I spoke about 2 new exhibits in New York around Van Gogh, the immersive experience. And what is really interesting about that is you had this massive space, a physical space, 2 different places in New York that are all based on Van Gogh's paintings. And it's not that they were just digitized and put on the wall. It was that his work was regrouped and used as the creative basis for this huge show. And luckily, Van Gogh's out of copyright right now. And it was good. It was very interesting. And it was all open source stuff. It's attracted literally millions of people. And it's the other interesting thing is our people are willing to pay quite a bit of money to see this show. And it's a kind of a choreographed thing where you start and you walk through it. One of the shows has a VR experience. You pay extra for that. But in this, here you have this museum-like show, although it's only digits, it's only light, which goes back to what you have, the first one to do that at Atelier des Lumières in Paris. So this brings into question, this is really the force of what a big general public feels comfortable with now, that they're so excited about. It's gone global, this exhibit, in various variations, like a theme and variations is global now. And it's one of the biggest shows of blockbusters ever to exist. And basically it's light in a big space.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's super interesting. I mean, I guess it kind of then questions or brings into question the status of the digital image, right? What is it about mediation and remediation of the artifact or the object of art that then gets translated into computational material? And what is it about the status of the networked image that then becomes part of the lexicon of traditional art museums? I think that's kind of interesting, right? It becomes a consumer product.
But on some level, I mean, art always will focus back and eventually speak the language of the consumer insofar as that pop culture will take from leading edge art. And sort of also, of course, if you look at, well, for me personally, any piece of interesting contemporary work is going to have something that is not only sort of framed within the experiences and the histories of today, but will of course sort of speak to the past and will undoubtedly speak to the future. So with that in mind, I just think that really that's kind of why I also showed, and I'm very open with my sort of being first generation kind of digital native, and talk about my early childhood experiences, because the things that I have experienced and that's a part of my life are no less relevant than the things that have sort of I've trained in my professional life as an artist. They kind of are the two come together. And I'm not surprised to hear sort of Tula's reflections on the Van Gogh, the digital sort of virtual Van Gogh exhibit, and the public's perception of that, because we exist at a point in history now where this has been a part of so many people's lives, from the start. And not that they will think about it in the language and in the ways that we hear in this, as specialists in the field are going to talk about it, but it's something innate to them, and I've watched this with my own daughter as she's sort of grown up. She's now in her early 20s. She's at University of Liverpool studying computer science and doing well. But she's taken this journey. And so for her, digital art, even sort of looking past the fact that her father is, a visual artist that uses all these computational methods and processes in his work, for her, growing up with all of that, sort of the digital and the virtual, the gaming, the sort of the techno pop, the blendings of East and West, this is just what her life is. So kind of back to your original sort of point, Rachel, I think for me, a lot of this kind of it sort of centers around life and experience. So, and art sort of takes from and feeds back into life and experience. And I think that's, that is actually one of those important kind of common denominators across, we don't have to think about digital or virtual or physical and analog. We think about things like experience. We think about life. We think about sort of connections, relationships, authenticity. We think about the things that are important to us wherever we happen to be. And often we're in multiple places at multiple times, or at the same time even. So yeah, that's kind of my take on that.
Well, it's interesting because I was taking notes while Rachel and Michael were speaking, and when Rachel, you mentioned the word binary, I wrote down before at the very beginning the word identity, how our identities have been affected by COVID, and so institutions or museums had to find new identities, and we all had to find a new identity, well, very often. And then binary and identity, and then I know that digital versus with non-digital, that was your question. To me, I don't see virtual versus analog or digital versus non-digital. To me, I see at the moment, as for gender, and then I go back to binary and identity, I see something fluid. As for gender nowadays, finally, luckily, I'll say, I don't think in terms of something that is digital or non-digital. I think the key word is experience. And Michael, you just mentioned authenticity. I think that is the key word. Digital, non-digital, virtual, analog, these are tools. And even if in a museum's, well, analog, let's say, non-digital, is traditionally probably the 99% of collections, so physical objects. That is not a limit. That is a strength that can be transformed through the use of digital technology to something that can belong to everybody, because the digital experience can be owned by everybody, can be changed, can be translated in something different. And that is the very interesting part, because of course we can't touch the physical object that is kept in a museum. It will be possible, I hope, in a very close future when, for example, and I'm speaking of 3D objects, when 3D printing will allow people to print from home copies of objects, and so many projects, well, including musical instruments on that will virtually allow people that are living from the other side of the world to print 18th century flute that I scanned here to play it at home in Japan, China, or any other very far country. So for me, again, I don't see a versus. I see something fluid between the two, and that's the most interesting thing in the search of something that is authentic in terms of experience.
Well, I just want to say, add a little something to what Emmanuel said, because I mean, my background in me when I was a musician, it was all about the physical instrument. And if you had in your hand some great instrument and you had studied with some great player, the whole thing had a kind of a spiritual feeling to it. You actually had the spiritual energy coming from these great instruments and that you're playing, and that had this sound that was partly yours and partly theirs, really. It's a very, very, that in itself, I wonder if that kind of experience is going to, hopefully, I hope that it does remain. So you might be studying, all your research might be digital about these objects, but when that object is in your hand and you're playing it and looking at it, touching it, it's yours. It's a very, very special experience. And I think there's with you come into a museum, even if you went to that very immersive experience of Van Gogh, when you're standing in front of that painting as a real object, there's some other thing that comes into play. And it would be different for every person, depending, someone else looked at a haute terre flute, they might not get that excited about it. But if you have, depending on your own, what you do, how you see these objects, what they represent to you. So that's another kind of the emotional side of this, I think, is a very interesting side to explore.
Indeed, if I can just add a very short thing, that's because, and I'm fully convinced that objects, well, museum objects in that specific case are that's a phrase I used a couple of years ago, are a container of hopes, dreams, and projections. So they're just empty, waiting for us to come into the museum, and they're just waiting to be filled up by our hopes, dreams, fears, expectations. We made them live
Yes.
in a certain way, I think.
Do you think we're still kind of very much kind of connected to the hierarchy of object-oriented experience over if you're describing sort of your relationship to an object as a vessel or a vehicle or a carrier of these kind of affective qualifiers or like lexicon or elements, is it enough to spread or distribute the narrative or the story about that object to a faraway audience that can't access that object? Does that kind of substitute or take a different shape? Does that allow the object to take a different shape, or is it still within a hierarchy? Is it still lesser than?
I think absolutely the manual might have something to say about this, but from my experience, the creating a narrative around these objects that contextualizes and communicates that object, the experience, the history, and there's a lot of documentation. I think it does communicate another level of the meaning. It changes the meaning, how people see things. I mean, in my first book, Great Flute Makers of France, that was my kind of object to communicate the story of the social context, social and cultural context. And now with another book I'm working on, it's the same goal, but slightly broader. I've gotten much deeper into the social and cultural context of how these instruments play out with people, with society and culture. So I think it can be exciting, but it's a lot of work. It's not, you have to be but any object can be the springboard for some narrative. And especially when it's in art. I mean, that's really where art is telling stories and engaging people. And then they make it their own. They have their own things.
Yeah, and it's almost like the absence of the object actually makes those stories and narratives more compelling, because you don't have the prop, you don't have do you know what I mean? You don't have the kind of the vehicle. You have to kind of, the absence or the negative space, that the lack of objecthood across the digital divide, if you like, presents the audience with, is this, they're engaged and they're compelled to engage with that narrative in a much more kind of active sense, instead of relying on the prop of the object to carry it all, maybe.
Absolutely. I think being in time now with the possibilities of digital research, where you can cross all media, you can play out your narrative in much better way. You can include music, images, moving images, YouTubes. We still are very conservative in the publishing world in terms of being able to really represent a narrative as it should be, using all media, not and by now we have moved from this text-based world, but we still have a lot of resistance to that. It has to do with financial formulas, all that. But I think that's going to change. I do.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I would like for it to change, but there's something. I mean, if we talk about hierarchies, let's be honest. There are a lot of just because it's online, just because it's computational, digital, virtual, what have you. The hierarchies, that's one thing. The economics, the hierarchies, they're absolutely there. Absolutely. And sometimes it's even more nefarious, because most people don't understand the systems enough. And I say, people in the wider public, they don't understand the systems and the technologies enough to actually understand the conversations about sort of things, because we're used to notions of authentication and ownership and control and those sorts of things when we're talking about real world, real world ownership. And I think you only have to look at sort of the NFT craze and the idea of trying to basically take mechanisms of the sort of the physical world and layer those onto the digital virtual world. And whether you're talking about sort of things of like, okay, well, this is going to all of a sudden be a unique digital object or an owned digital object, and things that are very anti the whole sort of like shared space birth of the internet and virtual worlds that we know. So you know, so I think we have to keep that in mind. And it's funny, the more years that kind of pass by, the more I become more, I don't know, I'm not as hopeful as I was sort of coming out of sort of a science background and sort of experiencing a lot of these technologies and kind of first generation, kind of when they were just in the university sector. It's, you know, because there are just so many things in terms of control and finance and gatekeepers. And I think that it's part of, I see actually in terms of arts and academia, part of our job is to kind of push back and provide sort of a voice to speak truth to power. However, that doesn't mean we're going to win. And I would actually, if I had to bet, I think we will not win for some time.
We might not, hey, but at least we can try. And I think it's almost like we're duty bound to be, you know, kind of to agitate the conversation, to disrupt and maybe kind of try to dismantle the narrative that has been mapped onto the digital as this, you know, as sharing values with other super systems that exist within, you know, kind of market economies and, you know, real world transactions. You know, and maybe it is within the realm of networked or digital art that kind of language can reside more comfortably, perhaps, you know, where those questions can be asked, or we occupy the space, simply occupy the space.
I feel much more hopeful for digital art. I think this is a great moment for digital art because it can be embedded in so many situations. And I think now is the time museums are going to realize that they really have to think about this and have it in their collections. And so that's something very positive, I think. Just as new narratives, because you look at all this research literature, a lot of it is very codified. You have to have this form and only use these resources. And if you want to use what I call primary sources, like a tweet or something else, or an article in a newspaper, unless it's not quite for scholarly things, you have to have better quality. So they're missing the fact that most humanities scholars use primary resources. It's only the fact that there's not a real understanding that as soon as someone puts something online, it becomes a document, and it has the same value as like a newspaper article that just comes onto line today, as standing with something that's at the Archives Nationales from the 19th century, early 20th. It's the same kind of expression. So there's so many different types of expression, and yet within the scholarly community, we seem to have focused particularly on a form that I think also keeps a lot of people out of that discussion. So I think that's going to begin to change with more freedom, the digital freedom. That's going to be a new thing. I don't know if anyone, how do you feel about, I'm going to ask Jonathan about this.
Digital freedom. Well, I think the audience should have a freedom to actually say something if anyone wants to chip in. So we'll open up the freedom to anyone else who's got any comments they wish to make. Is anyone out there?
That's right. That's the good question.
I'll make one little comment if you like. There's a very interesting overall this discussion. There's a very interesting way that the Spanish flu in 1918-19, in terms of its peaks and troughs and how it happened and movement of huge amounts of people back from the war and all the rest of it, you know, and where we've got with this pandemic now, you know, there were at least 3 peaks and troughs with that one before it even started to go away, and we're somewhere similar with that. So if one looks at those sorts of going back in history, And then if you look at the history of photography, which is an area which I know a fair bit about, for the first 10 or 15 years, it was very exclusive indeed. You know, you had to be an absolute expert to do anything on it at all. And then it sort of opened up a bit and more people could learn how to do it and could become more commercial and whatever. And then someone out of the blue invented the Kodak. And is the iPhone 12 the equivalent of the Kodak? And will that change the way that people capture digital images in future? And is there down the line, I'm quoting an iPhone 12 in photographic terms and image capture terms, but is there going to be a magic moment in the future where something like the Kodak that actually gives what we do to all, that will happen within digital art? I wonder.
I think it's happening already, actually. Digital capture and curation is something that it's part of everyone's life, and some people are more deep into it. But video, more and more communication is a video communication. So I think it's beyond what we ever even imagined it could be. I think it's billions of people participating.
Yeah.
Even people in their
Yeah.
80s like Hockney know how to use
That's
technology.
right.
Yeah,
He
absolutely.
just got a whole new slew of digital
Yeah.
art
Oh,
on his
but-
phone.
And then people like Damien Hirst now going back to oil painting. So it's interesting how
Well,
different.
there was a lot of, you know, on the Lumen Prize, there was an awful lot of art done with an iPad.
Yes.
Well, I was one of the judges of that this year on the still image. You know, it was a heck of a
True.
lot. And so you're actually seeing people being able to use the common or garden tools that they happen to have at their disposal and make art. So is that, I just do wonder if there's this sort of Kodak equivalent, which we're either in the middle of or haven't recognized yet, or if it's actually happening around us, as Tula suggests.
I think that's so
I'm going
interesting.
to ask Rachel, since you're at an art school, well, how do
yeah.
you see the students relating to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an interesting, comparison, between the Kodak and the iPhone 12, and you could even take it all the way back to, like the Portacam and Radical Software back in the 70s, right? 60s, 70s in New York, where, and, but I guess the thing with that is that they found local broadcast channels, and they were kind of like co-opting that. And what is it about platform capitalism that we're dealing with at the moment? Looking at, the walled gardens and confined spaces of expression of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, where a lot of my students are constrained to represent their work through, their Instagram profile, for example, even though they have the ability to, to distribute and make digital artworks. Whereas I think the point that I would make is it's not necessarily the capture mechanism or tool. We have plenty, and it has become very distributed. And I guess the VR is the exception as far as economic accessibility. It's still very expensive to be able to make work within a VR environment. So those kinds of bars for entry are still up there, but I think it's really about the distribution platforms and trying to avoid the platform capitalism that is like prevalent throughout society and through the economy. So is it about trying to empower students or artists working within the computational or digital arts practices to find different platforms for distributing their work rather than relying on the kind of capitalist constructs that we're all kind of working within the digital environment? So maybe it is looking back to the kind of I guess looking at Radical Software as a model and thinking through, are there different alternative broadcast models that we could maybe start to co-opt, or looking at like the Fediverse as an example of kind of smaller ways of kind of creating smaller networks that have more autonomy of expression. So that would be kind of where I would encourage my students to start to look. It's more of the distribution endpoint rather than the actual creation, because I think we've got that already.
There was something that last night when we were talking about artificial intelligence and Cecile came up with with something which made me actually write it down, which was something like artificial intelligence as a medium will actually become, so artificial intelligence will actually become a medium in its own right, like film and television, rather than a tool of an artist. It will actually be recognized in future like other mediums that we work in quite happily. And that was an eye-opener for me, but I really like that idea. It appeals to me.
Any other thoughts?
Anyone else in the audience out there? Do
Well,
unmute yourself.
We have an audience.
Yeah. Well, they're all hiding. So if somebody wants to...
Is there any way? Wait, it says on my screen, I see 16 participants.
Yep.
Yes, no, there are people out there, but they're hiding.
Yeah.
You do have audience support.
Let's ask John Wine.
Hello, Camille. There's a real person there.
Oh,
Do you have any comments, Camille?
No, I was fascinated, but also doing something in the background. So I was, you know, what do you call it? Multitasking. Very interesting conversation. I was interested in what Rachel just said about distribution mediums, because I know I'm getting more into the VR medium, and there seems to be a lot of people exploring new ways to collaborate virtually in VR and socially. And so I think lots of people are interested in platforms and dissemination, and it'll come.
Yeah, I hope so. That's where it needs to happen, right? Excited to see what you're doing in VR as well. And it's so good to see you again, Camille.
Yeah.
And looking forward to your keynote talk tomorrow.
That's what I'm working on.
Oh, good.
Well, in that case, we'll let you all.
Yes, we don't want to disturb you. Yes.
Gotta get ready.
Well, then we're hoping your
Just
chair will
tweaking,
be
you know,
back
some
soon.
fonts and things.
Excellent. Good.
Well, I absolutely agree with Rachel that distribution is key. But one of the things that I've sort of watched over the years is that distribution has become more and more, you know, hand in hand with corporate entities. You only have to look at the rise of social media, and where things were far more, say, kind of garage user centric in the days of MySpace, you know, in the age of Facebook and TikTok, and, you know, it's anything but. And I look at the VR platforms, you know, I've worked in VR for 20 years. You know, I have like some of the really old tubes in their sort of headsets. And as they've come again into the commercial, into the prosumer, and now into the commercial space, it's all everything. It's all about money. It's all about finance. It's all about platform lock-in. It's a very difficult space to work in. And that's me saying that as someone who has worked their whole life and has had the resources to try to do things, you know, to kind of break outside of that distribution sort of paradigm that governments and corporations are kind of layering on us. And for that, no, I'm sorry to be the person who sounds negative, but I'm not positive about that. And Graham, I think your comments about photography and the iPhone and the Kodak versus the iPhone, you know, that's a very valid point. For me, the kind of the watershed moment is when we don't have to think about, does every person have a decent computer in their home, which we absolutely have seen. Certainly in the UK, which is better than most countries in the world, the answer is no. And I bring back to what I was talking about, access, digital divides, and, you know, using a phone. I mean, and also, even if we're talking about the phone, I mean, there were interesting articles that people were reporting on that some households only had like one phone to share between a whole multi-generational household. You know, so if that's the state of play, how can one expect that watershed moment to happen when, you know, the technology, the fundamental things are still so out of reach, out of touch of so many people? So there is that kind of like, those have access and those that don't. Because for me, the sort of the people that will end up being the great kind of creators, they can only come from the pool of people that this is something they have access to, this is something that they know about, that it's part of their life, it's part of their sort of root-based level experience, if you will. And if you take that away, we're not going to get that. So we're going to get a very kind of skewed, use of the technology in creative practice, like we get a skewed use of technology in many aspects of society, until we have a better sense of parity at that kind of base level.
On that, if I may, I'm not very positive because you mentioned digital divide, and I will add that the digital obsolescence, the fact that every time there's a new phone, we are creating much more digital divide because it creates bigger pictures. Bigger pictures needs better softwares for which you have to pay now an annual fee. You can't buy the software. You're not the owner of the software. So it generates a cycle that is never ending. And that cycle, again, I'm not very positive about, a day where every family or every person will have a decent computer and a good connection, because every time we move up this bar in terms of technology, we're just creating much more technological